pentagram dedicated to Henry Foreman. In the years of the primal war.
What is the moral of the story, ladies and gentlemen? I think it could be, don't take ketamine on the dance floor. I wouldn't advise it. Anyway, Agitators Anonymous, episode 250 something or other. What are we going to do today? Let's get a bit spicy, let's get a bit interesting. I kind of feel like maybe the podcast has been treading a little bit of water for the last while. Some cool interviews, and no, the interview that I was waiting for hasn't transpired yet. It will happen. But I thought to myself, well, another podcast about music industry stuff, me complaining about merch concessions, AI taking over, blah, 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 blah. You know what? People often ask me to do more podcasts about Irish history. And seeing as, obviously, Primordial is Irish, we have sang about Irish history, I thought to myself, God damn it, why not? So, today I'm going to talk about Ireland's political flirtation with fascism. It's a shadowy, secret, I won't say secret, but it's a part of Ireland's past that I think most people don't really realise even happened. It was either that or the Irish woman who shot Mussolini. Imagine that. Shot Mussolini almost at point blank and grazed his nose. How history of the 20th century could have been different if her aim was a little bit better. We will never know, perhaps in an alternate universe. So, let's get all of the other stuff out of the way, and I'm going to talk about, for no particular reason, no, it's not gaslighting, no, it's not because of Trump, no, it's not because of whatever. Just an interesting piece of history that I think most people don't actually really understand or know about. So, and I'm going to try and maybe do a series of these, because let's be honest, you don't need to hear me complaining about blah, 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 festival wants to take 25% of our merch. It gets a bit boring after a while, it gets a bit repetitive. So let's do some stuff about Irish history. So you can follow me on _Primordial to watch my, well, frankly, quite dull adventures, or Primordial_official. I'm not sure if that's more exciting than my adventures. I don't really know. Split the difference, who knows? And if you want to go over to patreon.com, Alan Averill, Averill, the man who shall conquer in April, then go ahead. There's some demos, there's some other conversations, there's this, there's that, etc. If you're in a band out there and you're thinking, I wouldn't mind, promoting my band to Averill's captive audience, then slide into my DMs. All right, let's do it. Let's get this podcast moving. So before we get into the episode, as ever, the podcast is sponsored by Metal Blade Records, the home of Primordial. So you can go to www.metalblade.indiemerch.com, INDIE, metalblade.indiemerch.com, and you can use the code AA2024, and then you type 10% off, and you can get 10% off your order. It is the home of Show No Mercy, Hell Awaits, Cannibal Corpse, Fate's Warning, Merciful Fate, Primordial, tons and tons of bands, Sirith Ongal. The list is endless. Times are tough, and that 10% off can mean an awful lot. And this is the only metal label that is still independent. Right then, now back to the episode. So, I got a few notes here and there. You can't quite just speak off the cuff about things like this, because you'll find yourself digging yourself into a few little holes here and there. But it's an area of history, it's a period of history that's been kind of forgotten. And that's partly because if you look at modern Irish politics, you've got Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. Well, the party Fine Gael, they come from this history. And I think there's been a very clear, I suppose, well, a move to kind of suppress this element of history of where they came from. But anyway, Ireland's forgotten fascist, Eoin O'Duffy and the Blue Shirts. This one's for Neil, who's been telling me to step up to the plate and do a podcast about this for ages. So Eoin O'Duffy is a name that seldom appears in everyday Irish conversation. Yet for a moment in the 1930s, he was one of the most powerful and controversial figures in the young Irish Free State. A war hero, a national police chief, he was a Garda commissioner, and the leader of a quasi-fascist movement that flirted with the darker political undercurrents of Europe between the wars. And I think that you have to clarify that a little bit, in that at the time in the 1920s, fascism was seen as a kind of a cool kid thing. It was a sort of technologically obsessed, industrially obsessed. It was about modernization and moving against, the sort of more agrarian moments of European history. Agrarian Moments is a good name for maybe a grindcore band from the Midlands. But it was, it's hard to understand exactly now, but Ireland wasn't immune from it. So this man, he was born, his name is Eoin O'Duffy. Go and have a little look up a picture of him. Angry little head on him. But he was born in 1892, County Monaghan, which is, the said Midlands, maybe, could have started that grindcore band, born 100 years later. But Eoin O'Duffy was a nationalist, began as a nationalist, an engineer by trade, who rose quickly through the ranks of the Irish Volunteers and later the IRA during the War of Independence. He was loyal to Michael Collins. I don't know if some of you have seen the movie Michael Collins. The clue is in the name. I would recommend going to see that, although, people who are supporters of Eamon de Valera kind of thought that movie was a little bit propagandized, But go and have a look at that movie. It might illustrate things better, but he's an Irish nationalist hero. During the Irish Civil War, positioned him on the pro-treaty side, which is to say that after the Irish Civil War, there was the anti-treaty and the pro-treaty. I suppose you could say that the pro-treaty side were those who believed that you had to do a deal with the Crown, with England, with the English Parliament, and there wasn't any other way to gain a form of independence. And then the anti-treaty side, who were just, they were, I suppose, the more militant revolutionaries among the group, who thought that you just had to fight until the bitter end, I suppose, However, this moment positioned O'Duffy on the pro-treaty side. And after the Free State's victory, he was appointed Commissioner of the Garda Síochána at the age of 31. 31, indeed. At first, he appeared to embody this new Ireland, as sort of efficient, modern and orderly, brought a degree of discipline to the National Police Force, which was severely lacking if you look back through history, and insisted in the sort of Catholic moralism. And that's going to be very important as I sort of try and unpick why fascism never actually took root in Ireland. And it has a lot to do with that. There's a geographical reason as well, but the Catholic moralism of the time of Ireland. And also, I suppose, when you come back to one of the reasons why many of these things happened in the 1920s, it was a post the First World War. The First World War really was just changed absolutely everything, and all these nascent political movements sort of grew out of the shock that the First World War caused. But beneath the surface, this guy, Eoin O'Duffy, was a man with a rigid authoritarian mindset, taste for uniforms, darling, most definitely, and parades. And that's kind of, when you look back through history, the amount of angry small men who've been obsessed with uniforms and parades, and the pageantry of authoritarianism is something that's reflected throughout. When you go back to the history of dictators, you can find everyone from Gaddafi to Pinochet pinning endless medals on their breasts, and they love a good march through a square. And O'Duffy was certainly, he loved that kind of thing. But in a vision of an Ireland that leaned, I suppose, less towards the democratic pluralism and more towards a kind of corporatist, Catholic-infused nationalism. To put it in context, the early 1930s, I suppose, were a time of deep turbulence in Europe. I mean, you'd have to be living under, well, I don't know, to not know that. But also in Ireland, Hitler had risen to power in Germany in 1933. Drug of choice, amphetamine, Elon, take note, ketamine, puts you down in the hole. And you're not going to make right-minded decisions on the Special K, are you? Sorry, excuse my dumb sense of humour, trying to bring some levity to the situation. But Mussolini's Italy was in full stride. In Ireland, Eamon de Valera had come to power, overturning many of the policies of the pro-treaty Cumann na nGaedheal government, which is where Fine Gael ultimately came from. Eamon de Valera was anti-treaty and reopening wounds of the Civil War. O'Duffy, dismissed as Garda commissioner by de Valera in 1933, did not retreat into private life. Instead, he sort of reinvented himself as a political leader. The Army Comrades Association was a group. There's going to be lots of names like that in this. And hey, listen, you asked for this. You asked for a podcast about Irish history. So, let's try and wade through it. Put on your shiny, your shiny boots, and let's march through a town square through this one and try and get through it. But the Army Comrades Association, a group formed originally to protect former Free State soldiers from IRA attacks, and became the vehicle for his ambitions. Under O'Duffy's leadership, I guess, they began to adopt blue shirts as its uniform, borrowing the aesthetic of Mussolini's black shirts. You have brown shirts, blue shirts, black shirts. Strange enough, they never picked yellow or pink, I suppose, Could you have even got that fabric back then? Maybe that was it. And they began holding rallies, marching in formation, calling for a more disciplined and nationalist Ireland. The Blue Shirts claimed, you're going to hear this again and again, to defend free speech and democracy, but the rhetoric was steeped in anti-communism. O'Duffy was a staunch anti-communist. Ultra-nationalism and Catholic traditionalism again. They sought to suppress left-wing activism and were clearly inspired by the authoritarian movements rising across Europe. And for a moment, and it's crazy, you can go and look at pictures online. If you put in Blue Shirts movement, Dublin 1930s, you'll find, much to anyone's surprise when they actually go and look at these pictures, or rows and rows of Irish people stiff-arming O'Duffy in the Phoenix Park, I think, or they almost rose to 50,000 members at one stage. It's absolutely crazy. And people are dumbfounded when you actually go and look at the pictures, because it so opposes their image of what Ireland was. But the following year, for a moment, O'Duffy and the Blue Shirts, they captured national attention. In 1933, they planned a march on Dublin. That drew comparisons to Mussolini's march on Rome. Of course, de Valera was like, he banned the gathering. And O'Duffy backed down, but the symbolism, the sort of lingered, The following year, Cumann na nGaedheal, which is CUMANNNNGAEDHEAL, Cumann na nGaedheal. Sorry for native Irish speakers out there who are going, your bloody West Brit accent, you're never going to get that right. They merged with O'Duffy's National Centre Party and the Blue Shirts to form Fine Gael. Yes, that's the same Fine Gael from where our boy Leo Varadkar came from. Fine Gael, that's their origins. A name still at the heart of Irish politics today, Fine Gael. O'Duffy was the first leader of Fine Gael. But his tenure, although brief and uneasy, but even back then, many within the new party distrusted his authoritarian tendencies and growing infatuation with European fascism. And he was kind of pushed aside quietly within a year. He was gone from the party leadership. But it didn't really stop there. O'Duffy's, kind of 1930s running amok continued. And in 1936, and this is crazy, he raised a brigade of Irish volunteers to fight for Franco in the Spanish Civil War. You probably know that song, El Quinto Brigado, which is about, I think, Irish people going to fight against the fascists in Franco's Spain. Our boy O'Duffy was sending people to go and fight on the opposite side. And it's a crazy, idiotic shambles, and poorly organised and politically embarrassing. The whole thing was like an utter kind of hilarious failure. Sort of ended in failure and ridicule. O'Duffy himself faded into political obscurity. He died in 1944. Had a state funeral, but his sort of relevance had vanished by then. But, kind of skipping over quite a lot of things there. But I kind of more want to get into the reason why this sort of moment of Irish history has been kind of forgotten, or sort of politely ignored, maybe one could say. And I think part of that it lies in the discomfort it creates in Ireland for Irish people. And it's something that, you know, if you're a student of history and you look back over, I mean, like, you don't have to just take the last, you know, the 20th century or something, you'll see how easily people just follow order, follow rules, follow a charismatic leader, and just adopt their tribal position. And Ireland has always sort of positioned itself as this sort of outsider country, this rebel country, and very much a left-wing country. But the truth is that at one stage there was almost 50,000 members of O'Duffy's Blue Shirts. But part of it lies in Ireland, for all its struggles with colonialism and civil war. It's always long imagined itself as an inherently, like, I think, democratic and resistant to tyranny, as it, you know, proved somewhat in this case. But the notion that it once seriously flirted with fascism, however briefly, sits pretty uneasily with that self-image, I think. Another reason is that, I mean, look, O'Duffy's movement failed. The Irish people still deeply marked by their fight for independence, I think, and wary of foreign ideologies, rejected authoritarianism. But it may not be quite for the reasons that people think. Many people admired, I think, discipline and order, and few wanted dictatorship. Obviously, you know, we've had the English ruling for such a long time. Before that, they don't. The idea of a different kind of boot coming down on their necks and pacing around the town square just didn't appeal to people, despite the fact that the Catholic Church, you could say, represented a sort of element of that in itself. But Catholicism in Ireland, though culturally dominant, it remained aligned with traditional nationalism, not revolution, not fascist revolution. So the Catholic, sort of rural diaspora was not willing, you know, or they didn't want revolution. So when you think of fascism as a revolutionary ideal, this is just not what people wanted. And unlike in Italy or Germany, there was no post-war reckoning or trauma to force the nation to confront its flirtation with extremism. It simply just sort of faded out, unspoken. And which is one of the reasons why I thought it might be interesting to do a podcast on some of the rather odd or strange moments in Irish history that maybe you didn't know about. Like I said, I'm going to do one on the Irish woman who shot Mussolini. Maybe next week or something, depending on not whether I get the call from member of said band I want to speak to. But you know, maybe that's an interesting subject as well. But even Fine Gael, the party that briefly included O'Duffy under his roof, quietly erased his memory, I think. He was never invoked as a founding father, his name not etched into its heritage. I mean, obviously. Yet history, as we know, is rarely as clean or comforting as we'd like it to be. Eoin O'Duffy, I think, reminds us that Ireland was not immune to the ideological storms or movements of the 20th century. It too, you know, Ireland also had men who looked to Europe's strong men and saw a model for Ireland's future, as many countries did, both left and right in the 1920s and 1930s. That those men failed is something to be grateful for, obviously. But it's also something worth remembering, I think, because democracy, you know, is not really protected, or what, you know, we perceive as democracy is not protected by silence or this like selective memory we have. It's very often it's defined by the roads you haven't taken, I think. So if we think about it, the royal we, and the special K is kicking in now. The rest of this might make no sense. Catholicism played a big part in Ireland's rejection of fascist ideology, I think one could say very clearly. It's almost weird. You could almost describe it like almost like a shield, the shield of Catholicism, which, I mean, held enough dark moments in Irish history. You know, the ghosts of the Charnel House. You may know this Primordial song, which is about institutional industrial child abuse at the hands of the Catholic Church in the late 19th, and actually to the late 20th century. This shielded other things, other very, very dark things in society. But to truly understand, I think, why fascism failed to take root in Ireland, we have to talk about something deeper than party politics or personal cults or whatever, you know, the strongman cult. And you have to talk about Catholicism. Not just as a religion, but as a powerful cultural force in many ways that shaped the moral and national imagination of the Irish people in the early 20th century. Well, just the power of Catholicism in In countries, if you consider it, in countries like Germany or Italy, fascist movements filled a vacuum, a crisis of meaning after war, humiliation at the hands of the victors to become the vanquished, rapid secularization, lots of other things, but they offered a kind of radical spiritual substitute for collapsing traditions. But I think that's just a very, that's a process of human nature that once you, the God of the gaps, once you remove certain cultural institutions and certain social institutions, things will rush in to fill that. And certainly the far right and far left ideologies of the 19th and 20s and 30s did try and rush in to fill, I think, a kind of political, cultural, social void of a class that was vanquished by the First World War, and which sort of punctuated the end of the sort of old social order. Perhaps, you could say that. Except for the fact that the vacuum didn't really exist in Ireland. They, like I said, they offered a radical spiritual substitute for collapsing traditions. In Ireland, there was no real such vacuum. The Catholic Church was already the central moral and social authority in Irish life, as it continued to until like maybe the end of the 80s, I think, early 90s. As Ireland hauled itself out of poverty in the 1990s, and it kind of the whole Celtic Tiger economy and a whole new kind of Irish young person grew up with, visions beyond its parish, one could say, dreams of inhabiting a different kind of world, and Ireland was sort of hauled out from the second world to the first world, because I would say Ireland was probably second world in the 1970s and 1980s. The Catholic Church was already the central moral and social authority in Irish life. Teachings were embedded in schools. I mean, certainly the Irish state after the famine in 1845 to 1849 handed over its education institutions to the church by and large, and we saw how that went. But it was it was familial in daily habits and language. It shaped not only how people worshipped, but how they thought about right and wrong, their morals, order and disorder, community and identity. For Irish people, especially in rural areas, because you've got to kind of understand, even at this moment, Northern Ireland was far more industrialised than the south of Ireland. Take a look. If you want to take a look into the history of the Titanic or something in these huge industrial dockyards, that's a very good example of how industrialised Belfast was compared to like Dublin or something like this. At least I think so. But for most people, Irish people, especially in rural areas, the church just didn't offer salvation, offered stability. So when Eoin O'Duffy, you can imagine him, came marching through the town square in his blue shirts, through these streets of Irish towns, talking of strong leadership, national rebirth, and militant anti-communism. A lot of people, I think, saw it as, they didn't see it as inspiring, but it was kind of unnecessary. The social cleavages, the social factors in Ireland were not the same, and to allow the same sort of ideas to take root. They even saw it perhaps as un-Catholic, and that was just not going to happen. There was already an institution tasked with defending Irish values, and it was the parish, not the paramilitary at this moment, I think you could say. And the hierarchy of the church knew this. I think while they may have shared O'Duffy's hatred of communism, many Irish bishops were deeply uneasy about the flirtation with fascist aesthetics, uniforms, salutes, and the cult of the leader. This wasn't Rome. It wasn't Berlin. Fascism felt very foreign, I think, to Irish people. Irish Catholicism, even a bit pagan, I suppose, the symbolism, which sort of went against the papacy. But Irish Catholicism had long fused with a form of nationalism, but not really with an ideological 21st century nationalism. 20th century nationalism. And perhaps, maybe even more important was the role of Eamon de Valera, who was Ireland's Taoiseach for it must be 30 years almost. He led Fianna Fáil, led the country. And he managed to absorb the cultural conservatism and wrap it in a flag of, democratic nationalism. Under his leadership, Ireland became more Catholic, not less. across Ireland you have these, very much trying to copy, I suppose, Russian state boards on board Planola, board Namona. They were like the board of this, the board of that, trying to insulate Ireland's economy against needing to trade with its evil neighbour across the sea. Of course, it failed because Ireland's sort of internal economy was just too small, and there was not enough output for these things to really work. But you still see this kind of legacy in Irish society now. His Ireland, however, was not liberal. De Valera's Ireland was not liberal, but it was stable. Ireland is one of the few, I suppose, European countries that didn't fall to any ism in the 20th century. It wasn't liberal, definitely not. I mean, they were still banning books into the 70s and the 80s in Ireland. But it was stable. It offered protection for traditional values, respect for the church, and distance from foreign entanglements. So O'Duffy's movement was like a very extreme answer to a question that no one was really asking. I think you could say that. So yes, Ireland flirted with fascism, but never embraced it. I think of still the society, when they know about it, are quite proud of that. And part of that is because the space that fascism might have occupied, the need for identity, for order, for meaning was already filled. Catholicism, for all its complications and contradictions, you don't need me to tell you that, it acted as a kind of shield. Not a progressive one, but a deeply rooted one. And it preferred rosary beads to armbands. I think maybe you could sum up my view on these things like that. And in the end, the Irish people shaped more by the rhythms of mass than Mussolini. Mussolini, yes. Good track that. Who sang that? I can't remember. Anyway, they quietly turned their backs on Eoin O'Duffy and the promise of fascist revolution. And like I said, sometimes it's better to look at the roads you didn't take than the roads you took to understand these kind of things. Across much of Europe in the 20s and 30s, fascism rose in the ashes of war. Italy, Germany, Austria. Nations broken by the First World War, humiliated by defeat, like I said, burdened by reparations, and flooded with angry, disillusioned veterans, I think, which also is quite important. But the war left wounds in ordinary politics couldn't heal, I think you would say. And then into that void marched strong men, uniform slogans, enemies, promises of national rebirth, and definitely, pointing fingers at who was definitely to blame for this and that and the other, this othering of people. But Ireland was different, because I think that's the kind of the last part of this, is that it was, and it's the same for many things. When considering Ireland, it's just an island apart geographically. It's just apart. Even though over 200,000 Irishmen fought in the Great War, and thousands died in the First World War, the war itself didn't touch Irish soil. No Irish towns were bombed, no trenches dug into the countryside. Ireland didn't lose an empire, obviously. It was in the process of breaking or attempting to break free from one. And that difference, I think, really matters when you think about these things. So where fascism in Europe kind of fed on humiliation, Ireland had a different story. You could say it was being in the process of being humiliated by the Catholic Church. But the story of resistance and hard-won independence, by the early 1930s, the Irish Free State was just kind of finding its feet. It was conservative, it was Catholic, it was deeply divided by civil war scars. But it's a place where people still, I think, believed in a promise of a national future. I think, it's something weird is like, when you've probably been watching that Douglas Murray, what's his name, Dave Smith argument on Joe Rogan, and just to veer off topic for a moment. And Douglas Murray kept on saying to him, well, you haven't been there. And I often thought about historians. Could you apply the same logic to historians writing about history? You could say, well, you obviously weren't there either. I mean, I wasn't in Ireland in the 1930s. But a modern historian writing about Rome with authority wasn't there either. It kind of broke my brain a bit. It seemed to me to be a bit of a sort of disingenuous argument on some level, even though I kind of understood it, the idea about expertise. Anyway, what am I talking about? Yeah. So fascism, with its rhetoric of decay and rebirth, it didn't resonate the same way. There's no Versailles Treaty here. There's no Weimar inflation, no mass demobilized army ready to kind of storm the capital. Pain, poverty, emigration. But there wasn't an existential trauma, I think, that allows radical ideologies to grow from. And of course, geography. I've said this before to many of my friends from both sides of the political divide, that very often the sexy answer as to why there ends up being a revolt or a civil war in some faraway city, sometimes it's about geography. Sometimes it's about the weather. There's been no rain, so there's no crops. So, the poor in Syria come into the city, and the Alawites are a minority, and they riot for bread, and there's a difference in religion that gets a wound opened by people not being able to feed themselves because of the weather. Not a very sexy answer, but like I said, the moral or the principle of Agitators Anonymous is to sit in the grey area, the complicated grey area where there's too many reasons for something to happen to make it very obvious. But so, Catholicism and the Gaelic revival filled the spiritual and cultural roles that fascist movements elsewhere tried to claim. Even though William Butler Yeats at the end of his life kind of flirted a bit with the right, and maybe that's something that's quite interesting to talk to as well. William Butler Yeats and the Golden Dawn, the occult movement, by the way. His relationship to Crowley, to magic, to Irish revivalism, Gaelic revivalism, and ultimately sort of flirtations with some of the right. It's deeply, deeply fascinating. So maybe I'll discuss him at some other stage. But when O'Duffy stood in front of crowds in his blue shirt, was it royal blue or baby blue? I can't remember. Sure, it was all black and white then anyway, says you. But invoking discipline and destiny, the applause, I think, was pretty fleeting. His vision, borrowed from Berlin and Rome, it didn't really fit Irish people. Doesn't really fit us. Sounded like a foreign accent, I think you could say. In the end, fascism didn't fail in Ireland because no one tried. Someone did, and maybe you've never heard of him until you've listened to this. But it failed because the conditions that gave it life elsewhere never really took hold here. The trauma was different. The story was different. And sometimes history is shaped, as I said, by just as much by what passes a nation by than what the nation latches onto. By the way, let me know if this is something you think I should keep on doing, discussing these kind of things in my own offhand and reverential manner. Remember, I'm just a singer in a heavy metal band. I'm not a historian. But, just thought it might be interesting to just have a little look at some unusual moments of Irish history. Maybe I can broaden it out a little bit. But this is something that most people in Ireland don't know about, I think. A certain generation don't know about. And I'm pretty sure abroad you've never heard of this movement, But let's pull this one over the line. The story of Eoin O'Duffy and the blue shirts. It faded, not with a bang, but with a kind of quiet retreat into the margins of the Irish memory. At one stage, he was one of the most powerful men in the state. Like I said, died in 1944, largely disgraced and sort of forgotten. His flirtation with fascism, the failed expedition to fight for Franco in Spain, which is kind of hilarious. It's almost Keystone Cops kind of hilarious. And his removal from leadership left him isolated. And Fine Gael, like I said, still in power. It's in Irish people's historical political muscle memory to just keep voting for Fine Gael and Fianna Fáil. It seems like no matter what they do to people, they just passed I think they're just passing new law giving landlords even more power over the rental market. It just seems like there's just no choice here. People will, almost like nothing they do really will make a difference. Fianna Fáil can, mismanage the economy into the ground and no one has anywhere to live. And 18 months later, people are voting for them again. It's just so weird. It's like some sort of deep, deep rooted muscle memory that Irish will just keep doing the same thing again. But he founded Fine Gael. Well, he helped found it. Like I said, quickly was found to be, distanced from the legacy. And with time, I think, was distanced from the history of the nation. And today, the word blue shirt still lingers in Irish political slang, often used by opponents to mock Fine Gael. You'll find, if you can be bothered watching Irish parliamentary discussions when usually when there's like 6 people in the chamber, none of them bother ever even seeming to go into the chamber. Every now and again you'll get one of Fianna Fáil calling one of the other, who they've been power sharing with, by the way, a blue shirt when it gets heated, you know. But the deeper history of the uniforms, the salutes, the authoritarian rhetoric, it's rarely taught about. I never really was taught about it in school. It's rarely acknowledged. It sits awkwardly in our national narrative because Ireland, like I said, likes to think of itself, not unfairly, as a country that resisted fascism, stayed neutral in the global, you know, kind of like conflicts of the 20th century, more or less, despite having our own conflict. And I think sort of prides itself on having a certain moral high ground that I'm not sure is always justified. To a large extent, you know, you could say it's kind of true. Ireland's Catholic conservatism, recent independence and its geographical remoteness from the horrors of total war, I think helped inoculate it from the darkest ideologies of the age. But this immunity, I don't think came from exceptional virtue, because I don't think that any people of any country or nation are exempt from rallying behind a strong man or strong woman, but from circumstance. And that may be the most terrifying and dangerous thing, is that it might just be circumstance that stops the balkanization of your country, or the Ulsterization, as they say, of your country. Just circumstance, just pure good or bad luck. And then everyone begins to, throw their tribalism out into the street. That could just be the thin veneer that protects us. And that is a truly horrifying existential. I don't think it's even existential. What's the opposite of existential? Real, I suppose. And fascism was attempted. It just didn't catch on. And the story of the blue shirts lingers as a kind of unspoken exception in Irish history, an uncomfortable footnote, I think, that complicates the tidy image of Ireland as a small, proud and morally clear republic, although certainly not mongrels. But is it hidden? Not exactly, but underplayed. The archives are there. The photographs exist. I urge you go all and have a look at them. O'Duffy's speeches can still be read. Thanks, Neil. And modern Irish politics rarely grapples with this chapter head on. And maybe I'm foolish in trying to do this or talk about some other elements, unusual elements of Irish history, which I'm going to try and do. Like I said, I'm bored talking about merchant commissions and how expensive flights are. Come on. Look, we're treading water here, so let's try and make it a bit more interesting. But there's no statues to the blue shirts, no street names, no museums. In fact, even the sort of one thing I think is very interesting is you can see the government do clearly call people who are protesting at the moment far right, and of course there might be the odd person in there who is, but there's no evocation of the blue shirts in this in the movement, in the protests. You don't see a core of people in the Irish protest movement. Maybe we don't need to get into all that kind of stuff, but lots of people are out protesting and angry with the state about this and governments about that with the other. A lot of the things are, I think, the government has kind of lost control and it's divide and conquer. So throw out things that divide and conquer. People have talked about that before on the podcast, but you don't see people in these protests aping blue shirt propaganda or not as far as I can see, not as far as I've seen. It's just, I don't think it resonates through the Irish consciousness that way. There's no street names, no museums, and the fact that one of the founding parties of the state had, if only for a time, a leader who embraced fascist ideology, that's Fine Gael, is treated less as a national reckoning but more as a political embarrassment, which is very interesting. I think it tells you a lot about the Irish psyche. And that's one of the reasons why it's probably worth remembering, or me trying to tell this story, no matter how clumsily. Because every nation has these shadows, whatever. What matters is, I think, choosing to acknowledge them and try and discuss them in some way, and not to pretend they never passed by our gate. Ireland was not immune to the tides of the 20th century, but it did something rare, sort of stood at the edge, observed and went, not for us. Not for us. And I don't think it was out of ideological clarity, but out of instinct for order and tradition and, the geography and the influence of the church, and that there just wasn't this vacuum for these things to rush into. And there you go. The history of the blue shirts and Eoin O'Duffy. A strange, curious, embarrassing, difficult moment for Irish history and for people in Ireland to grapple with. And like I said, I think that it echoes throughout, most nations and most societies, if the circumstances change. Well, my friends, Agitators Anonymous has been an attempt by yours truly to grapple with a strange and unusual subject. And I hope you found it interesting. Let me know I don't know how you're going to let me know. Or maybe don't let me know. And maybe, like I said, unless said member of band gets in contact with me, who knows, you might hear next week about the Irish woman who shot Mussolini. And it's a crazy story. And like I said, if she'd been 3 inches to the left, the history of the 20th century might have been very, very different. Well, my friends, Agitators Anonymous, over and out.
Dedicated to him reformers.
Well, I promised a little bit more about Irish history. People keep asking me to do huge Herculean tasks, like, please explain why the 6 counties at the top are different to the other 26, or, something that's going to take several podcasts, or is more likely left in the hands of the rest is history, or historians, or people who are probably better informed. My sort of potted, all over the place take every now and again on Irish history. Well, here's one. Did you know that an Irish woman shot Mussolini? Yep, that's true. So today's podcast is going to be about, her and that strange moment that, again, very much like the Blue Shirts, Ireland's nascent fascist movement from the 1930s, which again is almost forgotten. This story is almost forgotten, and she was almost forgotten until recently. Her story was resurrected and a plaque put up in her honour in Dublin. But I'm going to tell the story about Violet Gibson, the woman who shot Mussolini, who almost, very nearly changed the course of the 20th century. Imagine how different it could have been. This was before Mussolini met Hitler. So, we could have kept that moustache in fashion for a start. All right. That particular haircut might have stayed in fashion for a little while. Well, look, whatever. I'm not a comedian either, obviously. Let's get into it. Violet Gibson, the woman who shot Mussolini and almost changed the 20th century. Here's a bit of obscure Irish history for you. So before we get into the episode, as ever, the podcast is sponsored by Metal Blade Records, the home of Primordial. So you can go to www.metalblade.indiemerch.com, INDIE, metalblade.indiemerch.com, and you can use the code AA2024, and then you type 10% off, and you can get 10% off your order. It is the home of Show No Mercy, Hell Awaits, Cannibal Corpse, Fate's Warning, Merciful Fate, Primordial, tons and tons of bands, Sirith Ongal. The list is endless. Times are tough, and that 10% off can mean an awful lot. And this is the only metal label that is still independent. Right then. Now, back to the episode. You can support the show over on patreon.com/Alan Averill, AVE or ILL, the man who shall conquer in the month of April. All sorts of things go up there. I do a couple of podcasts a month. There's various discussions. There's a discussion right now happening about how awful 28 years later is. Wow, I had to do everything in my power to not walk out of the cinema. However, don't distract me. Let's get on with the story of one Violet Gibson. Now, as per usual, I'll be doing the sort of speaking off the top of my head, all over the place kind of thing. But also, I've obviously got to have some kind of notes to keep the ball in play. So, history is fond of near misses. It's quite tantalizing. The what ifs, I don't know if any of you have ever read those what if alternative history books. What if the weather had been different at a different moment when a certain army was trying to ford a river? Or what if this person had actually, such as this, in this moment, shot this other person? This is a counterfactual history, and it became a very popular thing, I suppose, in the 90s. I read a whole bunch of books like it. And very interesting sort of subsection. I suppose it's sort of looked down on by historians, but it's kind of fun and interesting. Things like, what if Gabriella Princip hadn't managed to get that second bite at shooting Arch Ferdinand on the streets of Sarajevo? He went up and around the hill and came back down, and he got another go. He got another bite at the cherry to change the 20th century. What if Violet had managed to aim 2 inches to the left? Well, anyway, counterfactual history. Very interesting kind of stuff. If you can take a look, you'll find some books about it. But counterfactuals, they haunt the footnotes of political biographies with the, what could you call it, the quiet echo of unrealized upheaval. What could have happened? One of the most curious of these near misses involves Violet Albina Gibson, an Anglo-Irish, which means an English-Irish aristocrat, sort of high society woman, turned would-be assassin, who came astonishingly close to changing the trajectory of the 20th century, of 20th century Europe. I mean, I joked earlier, trying to make some sort of silly joke about Hitler's mustache going out of fashion, if it ever was in fashion. But if she had managed to do what she set out to do, we may never have had the rise of Hitler. We may never have had the Second World War, and Mussolini wouldn't have influenced Hitler. All the kind of things. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's get back. Let's step back and go back to the beginning of this. But she came astonishingly close to changing the trajectory of 20th century with a pistol and a singular act of political violence in 1926. That she failed is a matter of historical record, obviously. But that her story remains obscure is, I would call it not only a matter of injustice, but a sort of confusing injustice. Because there's an incredible movie in there somewhere. There's an incredible story in here somewhere. She was born in 1876 into the well-heeled upper class of Dublin society. Now, you have to understand, in the late 19th century, you had lots of Anglo-Irish aristocrats. Protestant sort of upper class Irish high society people who moved in certain circles, but people like Charles Stewart Parnell, I suppose. There was a political movement within that for home rule, which was sort of a form of Irish independence, and it was quite popular with the aristocratic Irish Protestant high society, who saw themselves as sort of Irish, but under the broader rubric of the crown, I suppose. Again, I digress. I should be following my my script, but this is why you listen to Agitators Anonymous, is it not? To listen in when it's clear that I'm actually having some form of stroke and recording it for posterity. But Violet Gibson was the daughter of Edward Gibson, 1st Baron of Ashbourne, who served as Lord Chancellor of Ireland. Her upbringing was one of privilege, deeply embedded in the social and political circles of British imperial aristocracy. But as a young woman, Violet was never quite at ease in the role prescribed for her. Much of her early life was marked by restless spiritual and intellectual seeking. You can find an awful lot of this, as I said, in the late 19th, early 20th century. Most people don't really realise, for example, that William Butler Yeats was a member of the Golden Dawn, the occult, hermetic, Crowleyan society. At the same time, him and Aleister Crowley fought for, I suppose, patronage of that society. It's very common amongst the sort of early 20th century, the sort of Gaelic awakening within Irish society, where people were looking backwards towards Celtic myth and folklore and trying to sort of resurrect this, what could you call it, this sort of ancient Irish spiritual essence. And there's a lot of restlessness, and it appears in a lot of the writing of the time, mixed in with the romance of the sort of burgeoning aspirations of the Irish state after the First World War. She converted from Anglicanism to Roman Catholicism, which is a pretty big step, in her 20s. An unusual and even a quite scandalous move for someone of her background to come from, I suppose, the Protestant Anglican high society, or that would be Presbyterian. Well, Anglicanism is Presbyterianism, is it not? Leave that one in the comments. Next to your comments about Bob Villain. She spent years travelling between England, France and Italy, immersing herself in mysticism, philosophy and increasingly unorthodox beliefs. She became quite interested in the occult, it seems. And by the 1920s, she seems to be a bit of a sort of a mentally broken woman. She was in fragile health, both physically and mentally. She'd survived a nervous breakdown, and she was institutionalized for periods of her life. And I think that's one of the reasons why she maybe isn't held up. She isn't held up as a role model, or her story isn't so well known, because like many women of the time who kind of showed aspirations beyond their station, or maybe sort of were marked out as troubled, mentally troubled, she got kind of institutionally sidelined, even sent to mental institutions like many women at the time. She got sort of ostracized from society. But she survived a nervous breakdown, and she was institutionalized for periods of her life. I suppose what happened is that some historians wrote her off as mad. I mean, I wouldn't know enough to say that. But others argue that she had moments of lucidity and moral clarity that aligned uncomfortably with the political realities of the time. I mean, she clearly identified one of those when she raised her hand to try and shoot him in the face. But either way, Violet's mental state was complex. She suffered from delusions, but she yet also perceptive and politically aware. Crucially, she was disturbed by the rise of fascism and Benito Mussolini's grip on Italy. I mean, she doesn't sound that dissimilar to many people these days who would describe themselves as having... I mean, she sounds like an awful lot like people describe themselves now. Having mental health issues, but being acutely aware of the rise of fascism. I'm surprised her name isn't discussed more in certain circles right now. She should be something of a folk hero. So, well, maybe in my own small little way here on Agitators Anonymous, we can contribute a little bit more to her folk hero status. So, Rome, 1926. This is the moment of action. On April, and I will answer such questions as like what happened to her and how the fuck did she get there and all this kind of stuff. But in Rome on 1926, the moment of action, on April the 7th, 1926, Mussolini was at the height of his power, basking in the adoration of his supporters. He was walking among a crowd in the Piazza del Campidoglio in Rome, fresh from delivering a speech, carefully choreographed spectacle, typical of fascist Italy, a leader elevated as a demigod, the mass as a kind of chorus chiming in along with him. I mean, you should, if you do not know, you should really go and watch some footage of him making speeches and his oratory. But back in the day, you know, despite the amount of assassinations that happened, I mean, I was reading some incredible list of the amount of assassinations that happened in the years 1900 to 1920, but you could just walk almost unobstructed up to politicians. And into this strode Violet Gibson. She was then 49. You know, legend has it, dressed in a widow's black with a small concealed pistol. She had written letters beforehand suggesting she was on a divine mission to stop Mussolini. This is what her diaries seem to suggest. And when El Duce walked past, she fired once at close range. The bullet grazed his nose. A second shot misfired. Obviously, she was instantly swarmed by an angry crowd. She might have been torn apart on the spot had the police not intervened. Mussolini, ever the showman, used the opportunity to reinforce his image as invincible. He returned to the Palazzo Venezia wrapped in a bandage. You can find this picture online, actually. Just a little bandage. She seemed to graze the top of his nose and made a point of downplaying the injury. A bullet to the nose was in his opinion, for dictator, a public relations coup. Let's take a step back for a moment. How did she get to Italy in 1926? So the years leading up to her assassination attempt on Mussolini in 1926 was the culmination of a long trajectory shaped by religion, health, and a growing sense of being on a political mission. There's no single cinematic moment of her arrival on Italian soil, no dramatic crossing of borders with a pistol tucked into her coat. But it's worth unpacking, I think, the slow and deliberate way she ended up in Rome, both geographically and psychologically. By the early 1920s, Violet had visited Italy several times. She spent significant time there earlier in her life as part of a broader pattern of European travel, common among the Anglo-Irish upper class. Obviously a love of Catholicism. She'd converted to Catholicism. Especially its mystical and ascetic traditions drew her repeatedly to continental Europe, and Italy in particular held spiritual allure as a spiritual heart of Roman Catholicism. So she converted to Catholicism in 1902, became increasingly devout, we could say kind of extreme, corresponded with religious thinkers, studied mystical theology. Her mental health, already fragile, began to deteriorate. She had a nervous breakdown, as I said, in 1922, spent time in a London clinic. A few years later, she survived a suicide attempt in which she shot herself in the chest. I mean, that's just so crazy. But she recovered. But the act underscores, I think, the instability and intensity of her inner world. I mean, okay, she shot herself in the chest. Maybe she had a few other issues going on than your mental health issues now that some people wear as their, as a sort of a shield on their sleeve, or however you want to say. But by 1925, she returned to Italy, living quietly in Rome. I think trying to realign herself with some sort of spiritual aesthetic. Her official reason was religious retreat. She lived in modest lodgings, attended church regularly, and became increasingly fixated in the idea that she had been chosen by God for a holy mission. And that mission, to stop Mussolini, who she believed to be an antichrist-like figure. And I'll just take a moment there to think about that, because it's one of the points I always get into arguments with friends of all political persuasions. I think it's natural for us as humans, and I've said this before in the podcast, to assume that there's a structure. It's natural for us to want to make sense of everything. The idea that you're just on a rock hurtling through space with no purpose and for no particular reason is often just too bewildering for people. And I think it's the same when we try to understand history or politics or culture or society. Very often we like to believe that there's a structure. And it's not to say there isn't. There isn't a structure. There isn't like an elite class of people who do make decisions that affect the majority of people. But I always say this, like, one person with a gun can change the course of history. Not everything. A lot of people seem to believe that it's just all predestined, preordained. I got some responses to my interview with Cheyenne from Trivax in the comments. People saying like, what are you even talking about freedom for? There's no such thing as freedom. It's all been prescribed, preordained. It's all written out ahead of us. There's nothing you can do. And I always say, well, how did the First World War start? How did it start? Do we go back to 30, 40 years before? Is it only because Gabriela Princip fired that gun? The actions of one man or one woman can change the course of history. And the idea that everything is just mapped out completely is just mathematically incorrect. It cannot be. There are too many opposing forces pushing and pulling. It's just not possible for it all to be predestined, such as this woman living quietly in her lodgings, consulting with God, who believed quietly that she was on a mission to kill the Antichrist, and came within 2 or 3 inches of changing the entire course of the 20th century. Not paid for, not a paid psyop, not a paid stooge, not a what you call it, crisis actor, whatever else. Nothing, not linked to any political party. her mission to stop Mussolini, whom she believed, as I said, was an antichrist-like figure. Planning the assassination, her plot was not militarily sophisticated. She acquired a small pistol, likely a .32 revolver, carried it concealed in her clothing, and on the morning of April the 7th, 1926, she joined a crowd outside the Capitoline Hill in Rome, where Mussolini was due to appear. As I said, dressed in a widow's black, she blended into the public, and when El Duce came out, she stepped forward, raised her arm, and fired when he came out to greet the crowd. The gun was later determined to be reliable. It was not a matter of mechanical failure, but rather the chaos of the moment and her own physical instability that foiled the second shot. So she just managed to fuck up the second shot. She got the first off, grazed his nose, but the second shot she managed to fuck up somehow. And she missed. And like I said, the crowd, the police swarmed her, and she's probably pretty lucky to not have been lynched on the spot. But after her arrest, she was imprisoned and interrogated. She claimed she had intended to kill Mussolini to glorify God. Italian authorities were faced with a dilemma. On the one hand, punishing an Irish woman with aristocratic connections might create diplomatic headaches with Britain. On the other, executing her might risk martyring her or drawing attention to her dissent. Ultimately, they declared her insane and deported her to Britain. She was committed to St. Andrew's Hospital, a psychiatric institution in Northampton, where she lived out the remainder of her life, over 30 years, in relative obscurity. Her family never campaigned for her release, which I think is insane. It's crazy. And she died in 1956, her name largely forgotten, which, as I said, if you think about the political turmoil the world is in now and the immense desire society has for sloganeering, for flying flags, for the optics. Surely the optics of this woman would be an inspiring model for people now. But what if she had succeeded? Speculating, as is my wont on counterfactual history, I mean, it's kind of irresistible, but also a bit dangerous. But you can't help but wonder what might have changed had Violet's bullets struck true. Well, in 1926, Mussolini was 9 years into his rule. The fascist regime had already dismantled democratic institutions, repressed dissent, and embarked on imperial adventures in Libya and it's Ethiopia as well, isn't it? Abyssinia. I should have probably written that down, shouldn't I? Well, yet it was all still being consolidated. Mussolini had not yet aligned himself fully with Hitler. He would not pass his infamous racial laws into the late 1930s, but the Rome-Berlin axis was not really yet formalized. They were sort of eyeing each other at the party from across the room. Hitler very much the younger party, hadn't quite plucked up the courage to ask his hero out, you know. But there's no doubt, had Mussolini been assassinated, several outcomes might have followed. A succession crisis, number one. The fascist state was heavily personalized. I mean, they've been making, it was, you know, classic, or what became classic cult of personality. It was centered so much around Mussolini as the figurehead. Once, if he was removed, what would have happened? I suppose some power vacuum. But the institutional structure was not as rigid or as stable as Hitler's Third Reich, for example, would become. His death would have created a power vacuum. Though someone like Italo Balbo or Dino Grandi might have stepped in, it's unclear whether they could have maintained the same grip or public image. I would say not. I think that almost all of the things surrounding Italian fascism at this moment are around the cult of personality of Mussolini. Two, and probably the most important one, is the impact on Hitler's rise. Mussolini's success provided a model, and I suppose you could say a cover for Hitler's ambitions. A failed fascist regime in Italy might have undermined the perception of fascism as a viable ideology, perhaps. Germans who supported Hitler's appointment in 1933 might have been more hesitant if fascism looked fragile elsewhere. I mean, this is 1926, so this is, 7 years before that. if Violet's bullet had killed Mussolini, what would it have done to, as you say, the rise of Hitler in the 1930s? It might have been far more hesitant. It may never have happened at all. And 3, the delay or disruption of World War III. Without Mussolini, Italy might have taken a different path, perhaps reverting back to the monarchy, who knows, led governance, or more moderate authoritarianism. I mean, it could have got worse, but my feeling is probably not. This could have affected the balance of power in Europe, possibly weakening the axis, and I suppose shifting the timing or nature of the Second World War. I mean, obviously, fascism wasn't a one-man project. Italy's drift towards authoritarianism reflected deeper social and political currents, but charismatic leaders certainly matter in this context. And Mussolini's blend of his theatrical masculinity and his sort of, his vigorous alpha male status. You could just imagine what would have happened if it came out shot dead by a woman from the crowd, and not just any woman, a fragile woman with mental health issues who'd been in and out of institutions, shot the great leader in the head. Can you imagine it? In that sense, if she had managed to succeed, it wouldn't have just removed a man. It was striking right at the heart of the idea. You could just see the fallout being disastrous for Italian fascism. While Violet is often dismissed as mentally unwell, and she certainly suffered from psychosis at times, it's also important to note that she was politically aware. Fascism in its early years was virulently nationalistic, and it very much sat at odds with, strange enough, many, many people who believed in the divine power and rule of state of Catholicism or any other religious institution. Violet had spoken about his rise with the clergy at which she worshipped. And she arrived in Italy, her arrival was neither covert, but not even especially suspicious. I mean, this is the least suspicious assassin you could imagine. She entered the country as an eccentric but unremarkable expatriate, an aging, aristocratic, religious seeker, I suppose you could say, on what seemed like a private pilgrimage with her own mental issues. In reality, Rome was the end stage of her long personal crisis, where spiritual extremism met political conscience. That she got so close to Mussolini without any real interference says something about the lax security of the time and the degree to which women were not perceived as threats in political contexts. And this is really interesting, especially women of a certain class and demeanour. She just would have been, you can imagine the police of the time, or the security of the time. She wouldn't even be remotely on their radar of anyone they were scanning the crowd for. And it was paradoxically her appearance of fragility and devotion that allowed her to stand just a foot from the man who believed himself unassailable. And that's what is one of the most fascinating things about this story. Her story, though, has resurfaced in recent years. I remember hearing of her years ago, but I never saw a book at the library when I was a kid to take out. I never saw one in the shelves, in the family shelves. Her name, you heard about it, but obviously the internet has allowed, people like her, characters who were lost to history, to kind of get an almost some sort of new breath into the folklore, partly through historical biographies and a well-received documentary. In 2021, it took us that long, Dublin City Council approved a motion to commemorate her with a plaque acknowledging her attempt as an act of anti-fascist resistance. And so whether she was driven by divine voices or lucid recognition of evil, Violet's actions deserve re-evaluation. Certainly they do. She was not simply a mad woman with a pistol, although you could say that, but a tragic prophetic figure whose shot narrowly missed altering the bloodiest chapters of European history. And that's what's so fascinating about this. And you could say, in a modern world that really does idealize the architects of violence, it's worth pausing to remember, I think, all the people who tried to stop them en route and were just foiled by literally inches. And like I said, Violet Gibson, for most of the 20th century, was only remembered in passing, if at all, as an eccentric footnote in Mussolini's early rule. And it's only a couple of weeks ago, I was sitting in the very same room I'm recording this with a friend of mine, and we were sitting up drinking whiskey. Shout out to Ro. We're sitting up drinking whiskey and putting the world to rights. And, you know, we have some political disagreements, and her name came up, and there was just a yelp of recognition in that a yelp of recognition when her name was just came into the room, and immediately we started to discuss the story. We started to discuss how insane it was, because there's, for people in the know, well, not people in the know, well, let us say, we won't say that, we'll say, for people who study the kind of sidebars of history, or go off the sort of beaten track a little bit and find these kind of underappreciated, overlooked gems or heroes that have just been sort of kicked into the long grass, her name is about as famous as you can get on those terms. And when you meet someone who knows the story as well, especially at drinking till 4 a.m. and drinking whiskey, sort of helps the theatre, the Irish theatre of discussing her. I'm waving my arms, gesticulating here. Of course, that's no use to you in a podcast. But she was remembered only in passing, if at all, as an eccentric footnote in Mussolini's early rule. Branded as insane by both Italian and British authorities, she was quietly locked away in a mental institution really for the rest of her life, and largely erased from public memory. But as I said, in recent years, this has begun to change. And today, I think her story is undergoing a thoughtful re-examination. Slightly less thoughtful on this podcast maybe, but a re-examination nonetheless. And she's increasingly remembered not just as a disturbed woman who shot a dictator, but as a complex figure, an anti-fascist, a mystic, a would-be assassin, and perhaps even an unlikely hero. But after her failed assassination attempt in 1926, she was deported, as I said, to Northampton to a mental institution. Her family were embarrassed, aristocratic, and perhaps you could imagine relieved that she was sent away. They made no public effort to defend or rehabilitate her reputation. Despite, even in the decades after this, what happened with fascism, her image, her name, had no attempt at rehabilitation, no campaign to revisit her motivations or mental state. To the British public, if they thought of her at all, she was just a mad woman with a gun. In Italian narratives, she was barely mentioned, except occasionally as a failed footnote in Mussolini's mythology. That time a crazy woman tried to shoot El Duce and scratched his nose. And for most of the 20th century, I think the story ended there. But here we are on a podcast called Agitators Anonymous, and me, born in the same city. Now, to those who are unkind, they would also call me Anglo-Irish and a member of the high society aristocracy, but far from the truth, that is. Reared on the north side I was. But her story makes us think, I think, of, as I said, the sort of backstory sometimes in history. The tragic figures who almost turned the dial. It should make us consider mental health. The binary between insane and sane become more questioned. And some people now see Gibson's delusions and spirituality as coexisting with genuine political and moral awareness. I don't think anybody could question that, really, when you think about it. A renewed interest in anti-fascist figures. Contemporary politics has sort of shone a light back onto these kind of people. Where many people are seeking to recenter figures who resisted authoritarianism, and especially those who were marginalised, especially women who were marginalised. And that's what brings me to the end of it. And that's a sort of a feminist reassessment. Do we go there as well? Her case also benefited from recent feminist historical revisionism. The idea that a woman, especially one from an elite background, could take such radical political action, challenged assumptions about gender, class and power. There's no doubt about that. And the police on that day never saw her coming. So, they have put up a plaque to her in Dublin. after years of campaigning by activists. Why would it need a campaign? And historians, Dublin City Council approved the installation of a commemorative plaque in her honour. The plaque, now placed at 12 Merrion Square, her childhood home, reads, Violet Gibson, 1876-1956, shot Benito Mussolini in Rome in 1926, committed anti-fascist, lived here as a child. There you go. The clearest formal acknowledgement of her intent as political and not pathological. And I think that's important to say. Well, you asked for some obscure and odd moments from Irish history, and I thought, well, why not? Why not? Why not indeed? And she kind of stands in a certain historical space right now, these days. Not fully canonized, I would say, as a hero, but no longer dismissed as a lunatic. And I think that's important. She's increasingly seen as a tragic, brave and complicated figure, as I said, who recognized the moral threat of fascism earlier than most. And although told by God, she was willing to act on it, even at great personal cost. I mean, she surely must have known that she probably would lose her life that day when she pulled the trigger. And in certain circles is regarded as an anti-fascist martyr, some would say. Someone who should be honoured for trying literally to stop history from marching in jackboots across the 20th century. Not a household name like a Sophie Scholl or a Rosa Luxemburg, but here we are on Agitators Anonymous discussing her on episode 262, and it is my great pleasure to do so, to shine a light on some obscure and odd moments in Irish history. My friends, I'm Alan Averill, and who the fuck knows what I will talk about next time, but there you go. The woman who shot Mussolini. The Irish woman who shot Mussolini. Until next time,